Hi, so today we're going to be talking about what actually meets the criteria for PTSD. We hear a lot of people talking about PTSD, but the way the VA evaluates PTSD may be different from what you'd expect. So we hope that you'll join us for that. Hi, and welcome back to Hill and Ponton's VA Disability blog. I'm the company COO, Natalia Jofre.
And I'm attorney Melanie Williams.
And Melanie, as we promised, we're going to be talking about PTSD today. There's a lot of talk about PTSD. A lot of people think they know what it is, or how the VA is going to evaluate it. But things aren't always what they seem, right? Especially when it comes to this condition.
Yes.
So I think that where we should start is the basics in terms of, what is PTSD? There's a lot of talk about it now. But compared to previous generations, is this something new? Is it something that's always been around?
Yeah. So PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. It's when you have difficulty recovering after an experience or witnessing a terrifying event. And we'll go into in a little bit what qualifies as that event. So basically, there are different triggers that bring back memories of the trauma, and it causes intense emotional or physical reactions. That's the basics of PTSD. Now, we assume that it's been around, forever, but it really only became a diagnosable condition in 1980 when I know that tends to be surprising because before they tend to call it things like shell shock, or it would get misdiagnosed as adjustment disorder or even a personality disorder. But so in 1980, the American Psychiatric Association added it into the DSM-3. So that's when it became an official recognized condition.
So Melanie, what is the DSM-5?
So the DSM stands for the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's produced by the American Psychiatric Association. Right now we're on the 5th edition that came out in 2013. And so throughout the years, there have been different editions where the criteria for PTSD vary slightly.
Okay. And how do they detail in the DSM-5 what PTSD is?
Yeah, so there are different criteria, A through H, and we'll kind of look at each one in detail, although I'll skip some of the lots of details because it can get very tricky. But basically, you have to have a stressor. So that's the first criteria.
That's number 1, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So there has to be some kind of traumatic event, some catastrophic event. And specifically, it has to be actual or threatened death or injury or sexual violation. So it has to be something either that you experienced or you directly experienced it, or you witnessed it happen to someone else. For example, if you're in combat and you see one of your friends die, or even, if maybe you weren't in combat, but you were in Iraq and, you're driving and you have to be careful of IEDs that may be in the road. So that fear of death, that threat of death counts as a stressor for PTSD.
So let's give a real world example. And I know we used to talk about, if you witnessed a plane crash, that wouldn't necessarily do it. But if you witnessed a helicopter crash and your best friend was on that helicopter and you watched it burn before you, that might do it.
Yes.
Is that accurate?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It needs to be almost like a direct correlation to you, right?
Correct. Yeah. So either you directly experience it or witnessing it. The only other way is if you learned about it happening to a loved one. So like if, a loved one suffered a rape, or if a loved one died, and when you learn about that, you can suffer from PTSD due to that trauma.
Okay, so I didn't think that experience would apply. Mm-hmm. So it does.
Yes.
Okay. So that's stressor. Wow, that was just stressor. We've got 7 more to go, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So the next one is?
It's called intrusive symptoms. So you
Okay.
have to have either one or more of the following. So either intrusive memories, so basically when you think about the traumatic event without wanting to, or you have nightmares or flashbacks, or psychological distress to anything that resembles the trauma or reminds you of the trauma, or a physiological reaction to a reminder of the trauma. So like if you see something that reminds you of the trauma and you start crying, that would be or your heart starts racing, or your breathing becomes rapid, things like that. Those would be physiological reactions to the trauma. So you have to have either one of those, or more of them, but you have to have one in order to meet that criterion.
What about when they correlate? For example, I had a friend, he used to always have to face the door, but even facing the door, like sometimes if somebody slammed a door behind him, he had been in Vietnam. I mean, he would jump out of his skin.
Yes.
And actually even go to this position, which was to hold his weapon.
Yeah.
So it would that fall under the intrusive symptoms category?
That's actually a different symptom under a different criterion. And so we'll go over that in a minute.
Okay.
Intrusive memories is more if, you're just in your daily life, all of a sudden, like the images of what happened come back to you.
Come back to you.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Unexpectedly, I guess we could say.
Right. Right.
Okay.
That's a good way.
Um, number three.
Avoidance symptoms. So
Okay.
again, either you avoid any memories or thoughts or feelings associated with the trauma, or you avoid just any reminders like certain people, certain places, certain activities. So you try to stay away from anything that could remind you of the trauma.
Okay. Number four.
So it's called negative alterations in cognition and mood. So basically, it just means either you can't remember a certain part of the trauma, or if you have persistent, exaggerated negative beliefs about yourself or the world. So, for example, a lot of times veterans feel like they can't trust anybody. No one can be trusted. The world is a bad place. Extreme negative beliefs
Mhm.
that would qualify under this criterion. Also, distorted cognitions about yourself or the event. So, like if you blame yourself for the event, or if you find yourself in a persistent negative emotional state. So, if you're constantly angry, constantly sad, you can't shake those feelings. Also, diminished interest or participation in activities. So, you no longer do the things that you used to enjoy, or if you have feelings of detachment or the inability to experience positive emotions. So all of a sudden you find that you no longer love your loved ones, you no longer can be happy, you no longer want to be around the people that you care about. Any two of those symptoms that I mentioned falls under this criterion so that you can meet the diagnosis.
I've heard a lot of veterans talk about that, the lack of contentment. It's like they're home by themselves. They feel sad. They feel lonely. They could be at a family reunion with 100 people around them, and yet they don't want to talk to them. They don't want them to talk to them.
Right.
Not only do they not want to talk to them, they don't want to be talked to.
Right.
And they feel as sad and lonely surrounded by a group of people than if they're by themselves.
Mhm.
So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about there with that.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I've even heard veterans say that all of a sudden they feel like they don't have love for their child or their spouse. It's just almost like a disconnect of feelings. All of a sudden, you no longer have these positive feelings.
And I know you were talking about the lack of belief in like the world and what's good and that there is no good. And is that where paranoia comes into play as well? You know how sometimes they'll think, all of their calls are being tapped, they're being watched, things like that.
Yeah, that's definitely tied into it, because if you feel that no one can be trusted, it then leads into the paranoia, which is also one of the next symptoms that we'll talk about, and goes along with what you said. So the next criterion is alterations in arousal and reactivity. Basically, this means irritability, reckless or self-destructive behavior, hypervigilance, exaggerated startle response, problems with concentration, sleep disturbance. So the examples that you mentioned, being overly suspicious. A lot of times veterans have to walk around the perimeter of their house before they go to sleep to make sure that,
Yes.
nothing's out there, or they have to look under their car to make sure there are no bombs under their car whenever they go to leave the house. That would be hypervigilance. The other example that you mentioned, if there's, a loud slamming door, or any kind of loud noise like fireworks, a car backfiring, and the veteran jumps or assumes that position, like you mentioned, that would be exaggerated startle response. So those would fall under this criterion, which is criterion E.
And that's the alterations in arousal and reactivity.
Yes.
It seems like such a bizarre term. Like you hear that and you're like, what does that
What does
mean?
that mean? Yeah.
Yet that is, I think that you just gave the most relatable examples. And I think that sometimes veterans don't even realize that this is where that comes into play. Like I knew another veteran, every single time he left his house, when he would come home, he'd have to check the entire house, every single closet, under every single bed, every single nook and cranny, and had trained his dog to check it with him.
Mm,
And but to him, that was his normal.
right.
And so, but really it's a part of this condition.
Exactly. Yes, it's a symptom, and it's a very common one that so many veterans have without realizing that, yeah, that's not something that, everyday ordinary people do. Same thing, irritability is another one that they just find themselves getting really angry about small things and not understanding why. It's because it's a symptom of PTSD.
Okay. Next criterion.
Yeah, so here we get a lot shorter in the criterion, so it gets a little easier from here on out.
Okay.
So basically, the duration of the symptoms, it has to last more than 1 month. If
Okay.
not, it's doesn't really count as PTSD. The next one is there has to be an actual functional significance. So it has to cause significant distress or impairment in your social or your occupational areas of functioning. So basically, even if you have all these symptoms, but that doesn't affect you in any way, then that's not PTSD. It has to be something to the point where it is actually affecting your ability to function. The last criterion would be it can't be attributable to any substances. So, if you're doing any kind of drugs or alcohol or anything and that causes these symptoms, then that's not PTSD. It would have to be attributable to the stressor that you experienced.
And that's got to be a slippery slope because you and I both know that a lot of veterans, unfortunately, at some point, sometimes self medicate because
Yes.
of these symptoms, because they want to forget, because they're up all night with nightmares, because they're tired of feeling sad. So they want something to bring them up, or they're so. It's still, would you say that if even if there's been a history of substance abuse or alcohol abuse, that that's something that you can potentially work with to differentiate that it was a form of self-medication and not really what was causing the symptoms to begin with?
Yeah, so usually the symptoms come before the self-medication. And so, the set of symptoms is going to be attributable to what you went through, not necessarily the substance abuse. And let's say you were using alcohol or drugs before this event happened. A lot of times there's an uptick or an increase in the how often you're using or how much you're using because of this event. So that would be the difference.
Understood. That's great explanation. And just to be clear, that in order to meet the criteria of PTSD under the DSM-5, you need to meet the criteria for all of these. So all 8 that we just discussed. Is that accurate?
Correct. But so within each criterion, depending on which one it is, you only have to meet either one or two of the symptoms. So you don't have to
Okay.
necessarily have every single symptom that we
Right.
mentioned. It's within each category, you have to have either one symptom or two symptoms of that category.
Okay. Are there any other exceptions or additions or anything like that? Because I know that with you all, it's always, but wait, there's more. There's always some exception or some, exclusion or addition.
Yeah, so and not necessarily. I mean, the only thing to know is that there are two specifications of PTSD.
Mhm.
So there's something called dissociative specification, and the other is delayed specification. So basically, people who respond to trauma-related stimuli. That when it tends to be more focused on the dissociative symptoms. So like flashbacks are dissociative symptoms. So we know that that is a symptom of PTSD, but sometimes it's more focused on those specific types of symptoms. The other thing that you need to know is delayed onset of PTSD or delayed specification. So basically when symptoms are developed not until at least 6 months after the trauma happened. And a lot of times this happens to veterans because if you're able to kind of maintain routine and structure in your life, a lot of times you're able to kind of keep those memories at bay. But then if you have a major life event, like all of a sudden you lose your job or you retire and you find yourself having all this time, that tends to bring on the flood of memories and emotions. And that's when the PTSD develops. So that would be delayed onset PTSD.
Okay, great. How does, because obviously at the end of the day, we want to know how does this translate into benefits? So how does the VA rate for PTSD?
Yes, so there are specific ratings. You can only either get 0%, 30%, 50, 70, or 100.
Okay.
And each one is going to depend on the severity of your symptoms and how it affects your daily life and your ability to function. So a 0% is if it doesn't interfere with your work or school or family life or anything. 30% is if you have mild or transient symptoms. So basically, if the symptoms kind of come and go, it only happens sometimes when you're significantly stressed, or if it's controlled by medication. 50% is when it causes reduced reliability and productivity. Usually that's specifically at work. 70% is when it causes deficiencies in your daily life. So again, whether it's school, work, family life, there are significant difficulties, significant impairment in your ability to function. And of course, 100% is total and complete occupational and social impairment.
Yeah. I would like to just mention, and I'm sure you'll concur, that what we often see is that they're initially given a very low rating, and then we have to fight to get more. Um, the VA, unfortunately, in evaluating these claims, can be very dismissive sometimes,
Yes.
and make light of, well, this only happens occasionally, and throw a 30 or a 50% at the veteran. And in reality, this is something that they're having to deal with in many cases, not always, but in many cases on a daily basis.
Exactly.
Do you
Yes.
find that often?
Yes. So what we usually tell veterans is when you go to a CMP exam, don't minimize your symptoms. Talk to your loved ones and people around you who can tell you, or even provide buddy statements, like we've talked about before.
Yeah.
Who can tell you things that they notice that may not be normal that you think are just part of life, and they tell you, hey, not everybody looks under their car to check if there's a bomb, or things
Right.
like that. So talking to your loved ones, maybe even having your spouse come into the CMP exam with you if they allow that, because a lot of times other people around you can speak to your symptoms better. But again, the important thing is don't minimize, talk about everything, and even using resources like this, like our video, and understanding the different symptoms of PTSD and what it is, so that oh, hey, this random thing that I think has nothing to do with anything actually is a symptom. So let me make sure to talk about that and give examples.
Yeah. One of the biggest things, and I think that what I want to urge people to do or to know is that just because the VA awards you a certain rating doesn't mean that that is accurate.
Absolutely.
I meet so many veterans that have been getting 30% for 20 years, and yet they're unable to work. They need a lot of help at home. They're reclusive. They have issues whenever they do go out, whether it be, chasing someone 3 miles on the highway just to tell them off because they cut them off,
Yeah.
things like that. And they don't
Absolutely.
realize that's not normal. And you should be getting a higher rating if
Right.
that's the situation that you're in.
Yeah, if you find yourself constantly getting fired or having to quit because you can't get along with your coworkers or your supervisors, that usually means that you can't work because of your condition, because of your PTSD. So you'll want to make sure that you try to get a higher rating. But to get to 100%, it doesn't just have to be that rating. You could qualify for individual unemployability.
Okay, great. Thanks, Melanie. Appreciate
Thank you.
it.
Thanks.
If you have any questions or want some additional information, please feel free to visit our website or call our office. And otherwise, we thank you for joining us.